It was October 1979 when the first credible ripple of horror reached the ears of detectives in Los Angeles County. A young man named Joseph Jackson, recently released from jail, walked into the Hermosa Beach Police Department and told them a story that, at first, seemed almost too grotesque to be true. The claim wasn't about drugs, or theft, or gang activity. No, what Jackson reported was something far darker. He said that an old prison acquaintance named Roy Norris had bragged to him, in chilling detail, about the rape, torture, and murder of multiple teenage girls, crimes committed alongside a man named Lawrence Bittaker. The police took it down like they took down all jailhouse snitch stories, politely, cautiously, and with a raised brow of skepticism. After all, California had no shortage of disturbed braggarts and attention-seeking sociopaths, but there was something about this account. Its specificity, the names, the timing, the locations, the references to missing girls already on record, that started making the hairs on the back of detectives' necks rise. When Jackson claimed Norris and Bittaker had even tape-recorded the torture of one of their victims, detectives paused. That wasn't bravado. That was methodical. That was monstrous. At the center of it all, Jackson said, was a silver 1977 GMC cargo van. It was this vehicle, he claimed, where girls were tied, gagged, tortured, raped, and, in several cases, murdered. The van didn't have windows on the sides, just two thick, locked rear doors and a passenger seat that was rarely used. Its walls were insulated to muffle sound. Inside there were wire coat hangers, pliers, screwdrivers, and an ice pick. There was even a makeshift bed. Bittaker called it Murder Mac. To the outside world, it was just a tradesman's van. It passed in traffic like any other utility vehicle in a city constantly buzzing with movement. But behind those metal doors, crimes were being committed that would make even veteran homicide detectives sick. Before any arrest, before any headlines, and before the public had ever heard their names, the evil these two men unleashed was already set into motion. Their weapon of choice wasn't just their tools, it was their van. It allowed them to hunt, to stalk, and to vanish, all in plain sight. Like a wolf in sheep's clothing, the van was innocuous to everyone, until it wasn't. The women targeted were young, often hitchhiking, often alone. In the late 1970s, California highways were lined with kids thumbing rides, moving from one beach town to the next, trusting too easily and aware too late. For Bittaker and Norris, this was fertile hunting ground. They didn't need to chase their victims. Their van lured them in, offered them a ride, and then sealed shut like a coffin. Inside Murder Mac, time stopped. What happened between the moment a girl stepped into the van and when her broken body was discarded, often on remote fire roads, was something neither Norris nor Bittaker would ever fully explain in the same way. But the evidence, and eventually the recordings, would speak for them. By the time police began to believe Joseph Jackson's story, 5 girls were already dead. Others may never have been found. Each of them had, at one point, likely walked past that silver van, never knowing what it was, never sensing the evil behind the steering wheel. And each time that sliding door shut, another life moved one step closer to erasure. The case was about to unfold, but at this stage, no one outside the small group of investigators had any idea that 2 of the most sadistic serial killers in California's history were about to be exposed. Their trail of destruction would come into full view not because of some genius sleuthing or miraculous discovery, but because one man listened, and then one man talked. And so it began, with a report that sounded too horrific to believe and a van that held the truth no one wanted to find. Long before the silver van known as Murder Mac ever rolled down the Pacific Coast Highway, before a single victim was reported missing, the foundation for the crimes had already been laid, brick by brick, inside California's prison system. It was there, in 1977, that Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris met. 2 men with long criminal histories, different personalities, and one shared pathology. Alone, they were dangerous. Together, they became lethal. Lawrence Bittaker, born in 1940, had a lengthy record dating back to his teen years. Intelligent but cold, Bittaker's crimes began with theft and escalated to more serious offenses. He drifted from state to state, spending much of his adult life in prison. What made Bittaker different wasn't just his disregard for law, it was his lack of remorse and his calculated mindset. He was quiet, observant, and unemotional, often described by those around him as someone who didn't seem to care about anything or anyone. When he wasn't in trouble with the law, he worked as a machinist, living a solitary existence that masked what was growing beneath the surface. Roy Norris, on the other hand, had a background shaped by early instability. Born in 1948 in Colorado, Norris was shuffled between relatives and foster homes. His criminal behavior began in adolescence, mostly involving minor offenses at first, but his record grew to include multiple assaults. Unlike Bittaker, Norris showed signs of emotional volatility. He was impulsive, reactionary, and often described as socially unstable. By the time he landed in prison in the late 1970s, he had already been diagnosed as a high risk to reoffend. It was inside California Men's Colony, a medium security prison in San Luis Obispo, where the two men crossed paths. In an environment where most inmates kept their distance, Bittaker and Norris became fast acquaintances. Their conversations quickly went from small talk to shared personal histories, and then, more disturbingly, to shared fantasies and ideas. Prison gave them time, too much time, and within those walls, they weren't just talking, they were planning. Norris later told investigators that the two had made a mutual agreement while incarcerated. Their plan, discussed at length and in detail, involved acquiring a vehicle, targeting young female victims, and committing a series of abductions. They spoke in theoretical terms, using phrases like, "if we did it," or "when we get out," but both understood what they meant. This wasn't fiction, it was preparation. When Norris was released in January 1979, he stayed in contact with Bittaker by mail. Bittaker followed later that year, released in October 1979, and immediately began assembling the tools and equipment they had discussed. True to their plan, he purchased a silver 1977 GMC cargo van. It was a model commonly used by laborers, designed with no side windows and plenty of interior space. The van was chosen for its practicality, but it would come to represent something far more sinister. They modified the interior of the van, removing any elements that might raise suspicion. A makeshift sleeping platform was added in the back, along with items they had previously discussed. The van became their base of operations. It allowed them to travel the coast, approach strangers without raising alarm, and, most critically, it allowed them to vanish from sight in an instant. Throughout the spring and summer of 1979, Bittaker and Norris conducted practice runs. They cruised the beaches and residential areas, sometimes offering rides to girls, sometimes just observing. These trial outings were designed to fine-tune their approach, learning which strategies worked and which ones drew attention. Each drive brought them closer to acting. By the time fall arrived, the preparations were over. What had started in prison as conversation was now set to become reality. Their so-called experiment had a target: 5 victims, 1 for each finger of the hand. A symbolic goal that underscored the premeditated nature of their actions. They weren't impulsive. They weren't chaotic. They were methodical. And their crimes, as investigators would later learn, were not just carried out. They were deliberately engineered. As Bittaker and Norris took to the road in their newly christened van, no one outside their closed circle had any idea what was coming. Police departments were unaware. The public was unprepared. And the victims, they were just going about their daily lives, unaware that they were being watched by 2 men who had already decided their fates months earlier. The mission was no longer theoretical. It had begun. By late June 1979, the preparation phase was complete. The van, the tools, the routes, they had all been tested. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were no longer observers. They had crossed the threshold from planning into execution. Their disturbing goal, abducting and harming 5 teenage girls, was no longer a concept. It was now a schedule they intended to keep. The two had developed a routine. They spent long hours cruising through the beach cities of Southern California, particularly around Redondo Beach, Hermosa, Torrance, and the Pacific Coast Highway. These areas were frequented by teenagers, many of whom were used to hitchhiking or walking alone. In 1979, it wasn't unusual for a young girl to accept a ride from a seemingly normal pair of men offering a lift. It was the perfect cover. Their method was not random. They had discussed how to approach, how to lure, how to control. The van had been outfitted with a sliding side door that allowed them to act quickly and avoid drawing attention. Behind the driver's seat, The back of the van had no connection to the outside world. Once someone entered, the outside world might never see them again. The men used different tactics, depending on the situation. Sometimes, it was Norris who approached the girl first, offering a ride or asking for directions to distract her. Other times, Bittaker would engage from the driver's seat while Norris waited behind the door. The moment a target hesitated, they acted decisively, quickly forcing her into the van if persuasion didn't work. Their first successful abduction occurred on June 24, 1979. She was Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, 16 years old, walking home from a church event in Torrance. It was early evening, the kind of time when daylight lingers and the world still feels safe. Bittaker and Norris spotted her walking alone along a quiet stretch of road. They circled once, then again. She declined their offer of a ride. They drove ahead, parked, and waited. This time, when she walked past the van, they acted. What happened after that moment became the beginning of a horrific chain of events that would stretch across the next 4 months. They selected isolated locations in the San Gabriel Mountains for what they called trials. These areas were chosen because they were remote, with winding roads that led to fire trails or dead ends, places where cries for help would go unheard. These locations became their regular sites of operation. In their own words, they referred to the process as an experiment, language that showed just how detached they had become from the human cost of their actions. Lucinda Schaefer's case was their first full run. It tested their coordination, their planning, and the way they communicated in high-pressure moments. For investigators who would later reconstruct the case, it was chilling to see just how composed and structured the sequence was. They had no remorse, no panic, and no intention of stopping. Following that night, Bittaker and Norris returned to their normal lives as if nothing had happened. Bittaker continued working as a machinist. Norris moved in and out of casual employment. They met regularly to debrief, adjust their method, and plan the next incident. They even revisited the remote mountain sites to make sure no evidence had been left behind. As July passed into August, they were emboldened. The fact that there had been no police interest, no missing person headline connected to them, confirmed what they believed. They could keep going. And so, they did. Throughout the summer, the pair escalated their activity. They carried cameras and tape recorders in the van, documenting aspects of their trips. They became more confident in approaching victims. They began hunting in the daylight, in populated areas, convinced they were invisible. One chilling detail stood out later in the investigation. They didn't just target randomly. They watched. They circled. They sometimes followed girls for blocks before deciding whether to strike or move on. They were deliberate. The van, quiet, reliable, nondescript, was their perfect accomplice. It blended into the noise of Los Angeles. Nobody looked twice at it. It passed police cars, parked in neighborhoods, and moved freely without raising suspicion. It allowed them to operate in the open with horrifying efficiency. By the time summer ended, Bittaker and Norris had already abducted more than once, tested and refined their methods, and avoided detection. Their fantasy had evolved into action, and the pattern was just beginning. Authorities had not yet connected any missing girls to a common suspect. The cases were scattered, and the victims came from different backgrounds and locations. There was no clear trail, no witness, no license plate. But for Bittaker and Norris, each trip in the van was a rehearsal for the next one, and each next one was planned to be worse than the last. June 24th, 1979. It was a warm summer evening in Torrance, California. 16-year-old Lucinda Lynn Schaefer was on her way home from a youth event at the St. Andrew Presbyterian Church. She had chosen to walk alone, not out of recklessness, but simply because it was familiar. The sun had not yet set. She was wearing a comfortable outfit, shorts, a light blouse, and had her sweater tied around her waist. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary suburb. But that night, Lucinda crossed paths with Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. The two men had been prowling coastal neighborhoods for days, cruising slowly, observing teenage girls, studying their habits. They weren't hunting on impulse. They had a plan, one Lucinda unknowingly walked into. When they saw her walking up a residential street near the intersection of Torrance Boulevard and Hawthorne Boulevard, something about her calm demeanor caught their attention. Bittaker drove ahead and pulled over. Norris climbed out and began pretending to rummage through a map, pretending to be lost, while Bittaker asked for directions. Lucinda politely declined to approach. She kept walking. But this wasn't unexpected. Bittaker and Norris had rehearsed this. They drove ahead again and pulled into a driveway to appear inconspicuous. This time, when Lucinda passed by the van, Norris attacked from behind, pulling her in as Bittaker slammed the door shut and drove away. The van accelerated through residential streets before merging onto the freeway. Just like that, Lucinda had vanished, without a scream, without a sound, in a matter of seconds. They drove for over an hour, heading north into the San Gabriel Mountains. The men knew the terrain. It was isolated, rugged, and distant from any form of immediate help. Bittaker and Norris had previously identified specific pull-off points on remote fire roads, places where they wouldn't be disturbed. By the time they arrived, it was night. From this point forward, every detail of what happened was reconstructed from Norris's later confession and corroborated by physical evidence. Lucinda was calm, at least as calm as someone in her situation could be. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She tried to reason with them. According to Norris, she told them she wouldn't say anything if they let her go. But the men weren't interested in silence. They had made a pact. They had already decided that none of the girls they took would leave alive. Still, Lucinda's composure left a mark. Even Norris would later admit that she had behaved with courage and restraint. But in the eyes of her abductors, this didn't change the outcome. To them, her fate had been sealed the moment she stepped near the van. After several hours in the mountains, the men began the drive back down. Along the way, they pulled over at another location. It was there that Lucinda was killed. There was no confrontation, no witnesses, just the black outline of the mountains, the hum of distant traffic far below, and the finality of a decision made long before that night. They wrapped her body in a shower curtain liner and waited until it was late enough to avoid traffic. Then they drove along Highway 2, eventually stopping at a steep canyon. In near total darkness, they carried her to the edge and threw her over the side into a ravine. She would never be found. The following morning, Bittaker went back to work. He punched in like any other day. Norris wandered aimlessly through his rented room in Redondo Beach. They didn't talk about it with anyone else. They didn't brag. They didn't appear nervous. Lucinda's family reported her missing quickly. Flyers went up. Local police began investigating. But there was no trace, no vehicle description, no license plate, no witness to the abduction. Her disappearance was recorded, but the case file sat in a growing pile of missing teenagers, unconnected, unexplained, and unresolved. For Bittaker and Norris, the first act had gone almost exactly as planned, and what disturbed investigators later wasn't just what they did, but how unemotionally they recalled it. There was no panic, no unexpected deviation, no remorse. It was clinical, as if they had completed a task. Lucinda Lynn Schaefer was the first known victim in their series, and her disappearance would remain unsolved for months. Her parents would hold out hope, watching the days turn into weeks, unaware that their daughter had fallen into the hands of two of California's most cold-blooded criminals. The silence after her disappearance only fueled the killer's confidence. They had gotten away with it, and for them, that was proof of concept. Just 2 weeks after the disappearance of Lucinda Schaefer, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris struck again. This time, the planning was even more deliberate, and the psychological shift in their behavior was clear. What had begun as a test with Lucinda was now becoming a cycle, a process. Their confidence had grown. The risks had felt manageable. They had taken a life and returned to their normal routines without consequence. On July 8th, 1979, they were back on the road. It was a warm Sunday afternoon when they spotted Andrea Joy Hall, an 18-year-old honor student and recent graduate of Mira Costa High School. Andrea was hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway near Redondo Beach, likely heading home or to meet friends. It was a common practice at the time. Young people often relied on the generosity of passing drivers in the Southern California sprawl. But on that day, the vehicle that stopped wasn't driven by a helpful stranger. It was the silver GMC cargo van. Murder Mac. The pair pulled over and Andrea accepted a ride. According to later accounts, she sat in the front with Bittaker, unaware that Roy Norris was hiding in the back, a tactic they had begun using regularly. As soon as the van began to move, the dynamic shifted. When Andrea realized she was not alone in the vehicle, it was already too late. The men drove her toward the same remote mountain roads they had used before. They knew which turns to take, which areas were unmonitored. Their familiarity with the terrain gave them a strategic advantage, allowing them to disappear from public view within minutes of leaving a populated area. What separated Andrea's case from Lucinda's was how Bittaker escalated his behavior. While Norris's role remained largely the same, assisting with the abduction and remaining in the background, Bittaker became more controlling, more involved. According to Norris's later testimony, Bittaker insisted on documenting parts of the encounter using a Polaroid camera, a behavior that marked a new phase in their crimes. These were not just acts of violence anymore. They were moments the killers wanted to capture and preserve. Andrea Hall's disappearance was not immediate news. Like Lucinda, she had no reason to run away, but also no direct witnesses to raise alarm. Her family reported her missing shortly afterward, and local police began another standard investigation. Unfortunately, in 1979, coordination between jurisdictions was limited, and the case was treated in isolation, unaware of the similar abduction just 2 weeks earlier. For Bittaker and Norris, Andrea's case represented a turning point. They weren't just seeking to fulfill a fantasy, they were learning how to operate without detection. They avoided leaving behind personal items. They scouted new drop sites in the mountains. They even began tracking law enforcement patrol schedules to avoid possible interference. Andrea's remains, like Lucinda's, were never recovered. The killers had chosen their disposal site carefully, down a steep embankment, surrounded by rocks and wildlife, where evidence would be quickly scattered or lost. In later interviews, Norris described Bittaker's calm demeanor following the crime. There was no sense of urgency, no fear. It was as if it had become routine. What investigators would later find chilling wasn't just the act itself, but the emotional detachment. Andrea Hall had a family. She had plans for college, friends who cared. But to Bittaker and Norris, she was simply the second on a list they had committed to following, a list without empathy or hesitation. The case received limited media attention at the time. Another teenage girl, another disappearance. The public hadn't yet made the connection, and because Andrea had been hitchhiking, early speculation focused on her possibly getting into the wrong car, without any idea just how calculated that wrong car truly was. For the second time, Bittaker and Norris had succeeded in their eyes. No arrest, no questioning, no headlines linking them to anything, and once again, they returned to normal life. Blending in, waiting, planning. The next victim, they decided, would be different. The timeline between their attacks would shrink, and for the first time, they would not target one girl, but two. By the end of summer 1979, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris had grown more comfortable and more ambitious. Their abduction method was working. Their van hadn't attracted attention, and there had been no police contact, no close calls. Each success reinforced the idea that they were untouchable. But this time, they changed their pattern. On September 3rd, 1979, Labor Day, they weren't searching for a single victim. They had decided to escalate, to take two girls at once. That afternoon, Jacqueline Doris Gilliam, 15, and Leah Judith Lamp, 13, were sitting on a bench near Hermosa Beach. The girls had planned to hitchhike to a local party. They carried backpacks and snacks, dressed casually like any other teenagers enjoying a holiday weekend. By all appearances, it was just a day out with friends. Bittaker and Norris pulled the van to the curb and struck up a conversation. It was a method they had refined. Norris would do most of the talking, using his laid-back demeanor to build trust. They offered the girls a ride to the party. Jackie and Leah, unaware of any danger, climbed in. According to Roy Norris's later confession, the van didn't drive directly to the mountains. Instead, Bittaker told the girls they needed to stop to pick up something first. The girls quickly became uneasy. When they attempted to protest, Norris acted. He brandished a weapon and tied their hands behind their backs. The doors slid shut. The van moved north. But what happened next diverged from the earlier patterns. Bittaker didn't take them straight to the mountain roads. Instead, he parked in a secluded area near a dry creek bed and stayed there for almost 2 full days. It was the first time they'd kept their victims alive for an extended period. During this time, Jackie and Leah were isolated from the outside world, trapped inside the van with no way to call for help, no way to escape. What made this case even more unsettling was the killers' deliberate pacing. They weren't in a hurry. They weren't panicked. They brought food into the van. They spoke to the girls. They took photographs. It was as if they had created their own enclosed reality, one that revolved entirely around control and fear. At one point, Norris left to get more supplies while Bittaker remained with the victims. Their method had become more structured, their roles more defined, and with each passing hour, the chances of rescue slipped further away. Eventually, Bittaker drove the van deep into the San Gabriel Mountains, where he and Norris returned to the remote sites they knew so well. There, they made a decision. It was time to end it. What investigators would later uncover is that the deaths of Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp were particularly brutal, not because of one sudden act of violence, but because of the duration, the planning, and the complete absence of humanity. They weren't killed quickly. Their final hours were prolonged. According to later reports, one of the girls attempted to resist even in her final moments, using her feet to try and push open the van door. When it was over, the killers once again disposed of the bodies in remote terrain. They scattered belongings, they cleaned the van, and then, as they had done before, they returned to normal life. But there was something different this time. Bittaker kept souvenirs, not just photographs, but audio recordings, tapes that documented their conversations and the sounds from inside the van. These recordings would later become some of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the case, though never made public in full. They were described by investigators as so disturbing that seasoned detectives left the room in tears. The families of Jackie and Leah reported them missing within days, but once again, there was little to go on. Hitchhiking was still common, and without witnesses or vehicle information, police had nothing to connect the disappearances to any known suspects. To the world, the girls had simply vanished. But inside the van, Bittaker and Norris had already moved on to planning their next crime. The double abduction had worked, and the lack of consequences only encouraged them. Their next victim would be chosen carefully. This time, they wouldn't wait weeks. The hunt was accelerating, and they wanted to make an impression, a lasting one. By the fall of 1979, the pattern had solidified. Search, lure, abduct, vanish. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris had succeeded 4 times, without so much as a police interview. They had grown emboldened by the silence. No arrests, no media panic, no sense that anyone was closing in. But their next victim would be different, not because of who she was, but because of what they chose to do, and how. Her name was Shirley Lynette Ledford, and she was just 16 years old. On the night of October 31st, 1979, Halloween, Shirley was at a party in Sunland, a quiet suburb in the San Fernando Valley. She was polite, soft-spoken, and known by her peers as respectful and kind. She didn't drink, didn't get in trouble. After the party ended, Shirley decided to hitchhike home, a choice that many young people made at the time, trusting that someone would give them a lift, especially in such a familiar area. But the car that stopped wasn't driven by a neighbor or a helpful passerby. It was the silver van. Bittaker and Norris had decided that night they wanted to hunt in a more populated area to prove they could take someone even in the heart of the suburbs. They didn't cruise coastal highways that night. They stayed in town, on surface streets, in clear view of homes and streetlights. This wasn't just another abduction. It was a deliberate risk, a calculated test of their own boldness. When they spotted Shirley walking alone, they pulled over. She recognized Bittaker. He had previously met her while she was working at a local restaurant. That small degree of familiarity made her feel safe enough to accept the ride. It was near midnight when she stepped inside the van. What happened next marked a chilling departure from their previous acts, not in what they did, but in how they recorded it. Inside the van, Bittaker produced a portable cassette recorder. For the first time, they documented a crime in real time, not with photos, not with memory, but with audio. Later, during the investigation, detectives would hear that recording. Though it was never released publicly, those who heard it said it was among the most disturbing evidence ever encountered in a criminal case. Hardened investigators had to stop the tape. Some wept, others never spoke of it again. On the tape, Shirley can be heard trying to reason with her captors. She pleads, she cries, and Bittaker and Norris respond without empathy. Cold, clinical, and deliberate. They refer to each other by name. They narrate their actions. They speak to Shirley with a casual tone, as though they were speaking to a stranger on the street. The inhumanity wasn't in what was done. It was in the tone, the lack of urgency, the absence of recognition that she was a real person. Eventually, after a prolonged period of terror, Shirley was killed. But unlike their previous victims, they did not drive her to the mountains. This time, they did something different. something that finally cracked the wall of invisibility they had built. In the early morning hours of November 1st, just hours after the abduction, they dumped Shirley's body on a residential lawn in Sunland, in plain view, fully clothed. Her injuries were severe, but there was no attempt to conceal her or hide evidence. It was as if they wanted her to be found. This brazen act changed everything. Police arrived quickly. Forensic examiners noted the injuries were unusual, indicating prolonged trauma. But what shocked investigators most was how public the crime scene was. Serial offenders often try to delay discovery. This was the opposite. And while Shirley wasn't connected immediately to any other missing person cases, the manner of her death and the placement of her body suggested it wasn't an isolated incident. Someone wanted to send a message. The motive wasn't just violence. It was control, dominance, and above all, attention. Her case received media coverage. Local newspapers ran the story of a teenager found dead on a quiet lawn after Halloween. Detectives began searching for connections. But even then, without a witness, description, or suspect vehicle, the investigation stalled. Bittaker and Norris, meanwhile, watched the news unfold. They read the headlines, and they were satisfied. Shirley's death had gotten the attention they wanted. In their eyes, it was the final act. They had met their twisted goal, 5 victims. But what they hadn't anticipated was the growing discomfort inside Roy Norris. Over the following weeks, Norris became increasingly paranoid. He feared arrest. He feared that someone, somewhere, had seen too much. And more than that, he feared Bittaker himself. Their partnership had always been rooted in shared purpose. But now, Norris began to worry that Bittaker might turn on him. In the end, that fear would break the case wide open. By November 1979, the killing had stopped, but the story was far from over. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris had carried out a months-long spree of calculated violence, leaving behind a trail of disappearances, unanswered questions, and one very public body. But even with growing media attention around the murder of Shirley Lynette Ledford, authorities had no leads, no witnesses, no suspects. That was about to change, because one of the killers started talking. Roy Norris had always been the weaker of the two, more volatile, more emotional, more likely to crack under pressure. And after the final murder, something in him began to unravel. At first it was subtle. He became anxious, restless. He avoided Bittaker. He drank more. And then, one day, in a moment of misplaced trust, he confessed. The man he spoke to was Joseph Jackson, a former cellmate from the California men's colony, the same prison where Norris and Bittaker had originally met. Jackson was out on parole, trying to stay clean and working to rebuild his life. One day, Norris visited him in Redondo Beach. At first, their conversations were casual, talk of life on the outside, old prison acquaintances, the usual post-release small talk. But over time, Norris grew darker in tone. He began hinting that he and a friend had been doing things. At first, Jackson thought it was just exaggerated talk, a way to feel powerful. But as the days passed, the stories became more detailed. Norris described how they had abducted girls in a van, how they had taken them to the mountains, how they had used tools, how one of them had begged for her life. Jackson was horrified, and he was skeptical. He asked questions, names, places, dates. Norris gave answers, real answers. He mentioned Shirley Ledford by name. He talked about the audio recording. He even described the locations in the San Gabriel Mountains where the crimes had occurred. Jackson didn't hesitate. He went to the Hermosa Beach Police Department and told them everything. At first, the officers were wary. Another ex-con with a story. But the specificity of Jackson's account caught their attention. He gave them names. Roy Norris, Lawrence Bittaker, a silver van. He mentioned missing girls that police knew about but had never publicly linked. And most critically, he said there was a recording. Now police were listening. They ran background checks. What they found was disturbing. Both Norris and Bittaker had extensive criminal records. Both had recently been released, and both lived in the exact areas where the abductions had occurred. The van, registered to Bittaker, matched the description Jackson gave. At this point, detectives decided to act carefully. They put Roy Norris under surveillance. For several days, they followed him, documenting his routines, watching who he met, where he went. They wanted to ensure that if he panicked or fled, they would be ready. On November 20th, 1979, they brought Norris in for questioning. He didn't hold out for long. Faced with the growing pressure and sensing the walls closing in, Norris confessed, in full. Over the course of several days, he gave detectives a detailed timeline of the crimes. He named the victims: Lucinda Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Leah Lamp, and Shirley Ledford. He described how they had been abducted, where they were taken, and how they had died. He told them about the photographs, the tapes, the tools, the van. He even agreed to lead investigators to the remote areas in the San Gabriel Mountains where some of the bodies had been dumped. It was one of the most significant confessions in California's criminal history, and while Norris tried to minimize his own involvement, painting Bittaker as the more dominant partner, the scope of the crimes he described stunned investigators. But there was still one thing left: the evidence. Police quickly obtained a search warrant for Bittaker's residence and van. What they found confirmed every part of Norris's story. Inside Bittaker's apartment in Burbank, detectives recovered hundreds of photographs, many of young girls taken in public places, seemingly without their knowledge. Some were pictures of the known victims. In a closet, they found the cassette tapes Norris had mentioned, along with tools and personal items that matched descriptions from the crime scenes. Inside the van, they found blood traces, fibers, and more restraints. The sliding door bore scratches, deep, irregular marks that seemed to confirm a struggle had taken place inside. And then came the tape, the one Norris said existed, the one made the night Shirley Ledford was killed. Detectives listened to the first few minutes. Most could not finish it. The audio was real, and with it, the case against Lawrence Bittaker was no longer built on testimony alone. It had tangible, damning proof. Soon after, Bittaker was arrested. Calm and dismissive, he denied everything. He said Norris was lying. He said there was no van, no murders, no tapes. But the evidence told a different story, and the state of California was now preparing for one of the most haunting trials in its history. The story was no longer hidden. Thanks to one man who listened and another who talked, the survivors finally had a voice. The arrest of Lawrence Bittaker didn't come with sirens or a struggle. It came with quiet certainty, built on evidence, confession, and days of careful surveillance. On November 20th, 1979, as detectives closed in on what had become one of the most disturbing serial crime cases in California history, Bittaker was found at his Burbank motel room. He opened the door calmly, almost casually, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that his world was about to collapse. To the officers outside, there was no doubt. They had their man. Inside his room, investigators found exactly what they hoped and feared. Dozens of personal belongings, including Polaroids, items from victims, and written materials. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that painted the picture. It was the man himself. Bittaker didn't resist. He didn't show surprise. He didn't ask why he was being arrested. He simply smirked and calmly maintained his innocence. He told detectives that Roy Norris was a liar, that none of the accusations were true, that there had never been any murders, and that he didn't know anything about any missing girls. But detectives had more than a statement. They had the van, the tape, and a cooperating co-defendant. The van was a central piece of the case. Once impounded, forensic teams combed every inch of it. They found carpet fibers matching clothing from the victims. They found dried blood stains. Hidden inside compartments, they discovered ropes, handcuffs, and tools that perfectly matched Norris's earlier descriptions. Most chilling of all, they found audio tapes, including the now infamous recording of Shirley Lynette Ledford, no longer hearsay, now hard proof. Simultaneously, a team executed a search warrant on Bittaker's rented storage unit in Burbank. What they found there shocked even seasoned homicide detectives. Inside were hundreds of photographs, most of them candid shots of teenage girls walking, eating, riding bikes, or sitting at bus stops. Many were unaware they were being photographed. Among the piles were photos of Lucinda Schaefer and Andrea Hall, taken before their abductions. They also found victim possessions, personal effects like earrings, notebooks, a hairbrush, items that only someone with intimate access could have held. To detectives, the unit wasn't just a hiding place. It was a trophy room. Back at the station, Bittaker refused to cooperate. He denied involvement in every crime, and even when confronted with the audio tape, he claimed it was a joke, a performance, not reality. But his explanations quickly unraveled. Handwriting samples matched those found in his notes. His voice, analyzed by experts, was positively identified on the tape, and with Roy Norris's full cooperation, including guided trips to the disposal sites in the San Gabriel Mountains, the case had reached a level of certainty few trials ever achieve. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office soon filed multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, rape, and torture against both men, but their legal strategies would diverge. Roy Norris, hoping to avoid the death penalty, agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against Bittaker, he would receive 45 years to life, a sentence that, while severe, spared him the gas chamber. His cooperation included full courtroom testimony, participation in evidence recovery, and submission to psychological evaluation. Norris admitted his role, but placed much of the responsibility on Bittaker, portraying himself as the follower, not the leader. Lawrence Bittaker, on the other hand, refused any deals. He insisted on his innocence and prepared for a full trial. In public and in private, he maintained that he had done nothing wrong, and that the case was a smear campaign built on lies, misunderstandings, and a former accomplice seeking leniency. But the evidence told another story, a clearer story, a horrifying story. With both suspects now in custody and a case supported by confessions, forensic findings, photos, tapes, and physical evidence, prosecutors began preparing what would become one of the most chilling trials in the history of the California justice system. And for the first time, the families of the victims had names, had faces, had answers. The long search for justice had begun. Once Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were in custody, investigators turned their attention to organizing the staggering amount of evidence, a volume so extensive and disturbing that seasoned detectives admitted the case would haunt them for the rest of their careers. This was no longer a mystery. It was a brutal archive of premeditated crimes, recorded, photographed, and itemized with chilling precision. With Norris cooperating under a plea agreement, detectives had access to not only his verbal account, but also his participation in physically retracing the path of the crimes. Under armed escort, Norris took investigators into the San Gabriel Mountains, to the exact spots where the victims had been taken, assaulted, and, ultimately, left. At one such site, human remains were recovered and later identified through dental records as belonging to Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp. In separate interrogations, Bittaker and Norris painted vastly different pictures. While Norris described Bittaker as the dominant, calculating ringleader, Bittaker denied every accusation. He refused to confess, dismissed Norris's claims as fiction, and insisted that any photos, tapes, or items found in his possession had innocent explanations. But the evidence told a story that Bittaker could not explain away. The centerpiece of the investigation was the audio tape made during the abduction of Shirley Lynette Ledford. It was discovered inside Bittaker's rented Burbank motel room and marked simply with a handwritten label. What was on it would soon be described by prosecutors, journalists, and investigators as one of the most horrifying pieces of evidence ever presented in a court of law. The tape was approximately 17 minutes long. Its contents were never released publicly, and never will be. But in court, segments were played for the judge, jury, and legal counsel. The reactions were immediate. People wept. Some left the courtroom. Several jurors reportedly turned their heads away, unable to listen. One investigator later said, "I've been in this line of work for over 2 decades, and I've never heard anything like that." The tape contained the voices of Bittaker and Norris, clearly identifiable, and the voice of Shirley Ledford, terrified, pleading, and in pain. There was no ambiguity, no performance. It was real, and there was no defense against it. Hundreds of Polaroid photographs were entered into evidence. Many were of random young girls taken from a distance, some at bus stops, some at schoolyards, others walking alone. But among them were explicit images of victims during captivity, in the van, in remote areas of the mountains. Some photos showed the interior of the van, with items matching those recovered by police. Others depicted Norris or Bittaker holding weapons or posing in recognizable locations later verified by investigators. One photo in particular showed Lucinda Schaefer, bound and frightened. That single image, when cross-referenced with fibers and restraints found in the van, helped place Bittaker at the scene of her abduction. No amount of denial could overcome the forensic match. Inside both the van and Bittaker's storage locker, investigators recovered a collection of tools: pliers, ice picks, hammers, and duct tape, items Norris had specifically mentioned during his confession. Some showed signs of use, others were consistent with markings found on recovered remains. Prosecutors would later refer to these items as part of a mobile torture kit. The connection between the tools and the injuries described in autopsy reports was direct and compelling. Forensic teams confirmed that blood traces in the van matched the DNA of known victims. Hair samples were consistent with both Shirley Ledford and Andrea Hall. Carpet fibers matched clothing from the mountain recovery sites. In addition to the visual and audio evidence, detectives found notebooks and written plans, lists of locations, reminders, and what appeared to be coded shorthand about targets and routes. While Bittaker claimed they were unrelated, analysts and prosecutors saw them as planning documents. They showed a pattern, a structure. Personal items belonging to the victims, such as earrings, a necklace, and a comb, were also found in Bittaker's room and storage unit. One pair of earrings was confirmed by a family member as belonging to Andrea Hall. In the end, even without a confession from Bittaker, the mountain of evidence was overwhelming. The state had more than just words. It had photos, recordings, maps, timelines, and remains. The investigation had crossed from uncertainty to certainty. And as the preliminary hearings concluded, prosecutors made it clear they would be seeking the death penalty for Lawrence Bittaker. The trial was set. The courtroom would soon become the final stage where the horrors uncovered in that van, in those mountains, and on that tape would be laid bare before the world. The trial of Lawrence Bittaker began in March 1981, in a courtroom that quickly became the stage for one of the most disturbing legal proceedings in California history. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was graphic, and the public interest was intense. For months, newspapers across the country had covered the case of the so-called Toolbox Killers, but the trial would be the first time the public would hear the full extent of what had happened behind the locked doors of that van. From the outset, the prosecution made their position clear. This was a case not just of murder, but of methodical torture, deliberate cruelty, and a complete lack of remorse. Led by Deputy District Attorney Stephen Kay, the prosecution team laid out the charges: 5 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and criminal conspiracy. The strategy was simple but devastating. Let the evidence speak for itself. In his opening remarks, Kay did not sensationalize. He did not need to. He walked the jury through the timeline: 5 girls, 5 disappearances, 1 van, and 1 man who denied everything despite being surrounded by evidence. Bittaker's defense, led by public defender Raymond Wishnack, attempted to cast doubt on the credibility of Roy Norris, the prosecution's key witness. They argued that Norris, having already secured a plea deal, had every reason to exaggerate or lie. They claimed that Bittaker was being framed, that he was guilty of bad associations, not murder. But the defense faced an uphill battle. Not only did Norris testify in graphic, unflinching detail, but his statements were backed by photographic, forensic, and audio evidence that had already been authenticated by experts. Roy Norris took the stand early in the trial. Calm and composed, he answered questions over several days. He described how he and Bittaker met in prison, how they developed their plan, and how they executed each abduction. He spoke about the van, about the tools, about the audio recording. When asked why he was cooperating, Norris simply said, "Because it's the truth." The prosecution then introduced Shirley Lynette Ledford's audio tape. They did not play it in full, but they played enough. Court reporters described the room as going completely silent. Some jurors wept. Several spectators left. Even seasoned attorneys looked shaken. The voices on the tape were clear: Bittaker's, Norris's, Shirley's. To the jury, it was no longer just a story. It was evidence in their own ears. On February 17th, 1981, after just a few days of deliberation, the jury found Lawrence Bittaker guilty on all counts: 5 murders, 5 kidnappings, and multiple counts of torture and rape. The court then entered the penalty phase, where jurors would decide whether Bittaker should receive life imprisonment or the death penalty. During this phase, the prosecution called upon the families of the victims. Their emotional testimonies underscored the human cost of the crimes. One father spoke of his daughter's empty room, unchanged since the day she disappeared. Another described years of waiting, hoping for a phone call that never came. Bittaker remained unmoved. On March 24, 1981, the jury delivered its decision: death. As the sentence was read, there was no celebration, only silence. The families of the victims wept quietly. Reporters scribbled notes. Bittaker stared straight ahead. The judge called the crimes the most shocking and barbaric acts I have ever encountered in my career. Bittaker was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he would join California's death row. He would remain there for decades, filing appeals, maintaining his innocence, and continuing to show little to no remorse. Meanwhile, Roy Norris, sentenced to 45 years to life, was sent to a separate facility, where he would also spend the rest of his life behind bars. For the public, the trial offered both closure and horror. Closure that the killers had been caught. Horror at the level of planning, cruelty, and detachment that had been laid bare in court. But the story wasn't over. Not for the victims' families, not for the investigators who had listened to those tapes, and not for the justice system, tasked with deciding when, or if, Lawrence Bittaker would ever pay the full price for his crimes. Over the next several decades, Bittaker filed numerous appeals, seeking to overturn his conviction, reduce his sentence, and suppress key pieces of evidence, including the audio tape. He argued procedural errors, ineffective counsel, and even questioned the authenticity of Norris's testimony. Each appeal was carefully reviewed and consistently rejected. The courts found no merit in his arguments. The evidence, both physical and testimonial, was too strong. The original trial had been thorough. The conviction was upheld repeatedly at the state and federal levels. Bittaker remained defiant throughout. He never expressed remorse, never admitted guilt, and maintained until his death that he had been wrongly accused. He gave interviews in which he referred to the prosecution as a political performance and called the trial a media circus. These statements only solidified public perception of him as cold and calculating. To the families of the victims, these appeals were not just legal formalities. They were emotional reopenings of wounds they had tried to heal. Each time Bittaker's name appeared in court records or headlines, the pain resurfaced. Meanwhile, Roy Norris served his sentence at various California prisons. Unlike Bittaker, he had accepted responsibility in a legal sense. His cooperation had helped secure the case, but his plea deal guaranteed he would avoid the death penalty. Though Norris expressed some regret in later statements, it was viewed by many as self-preservation rather than genuine remorse. He spent his life behind bars, rarely speaking publicly. His requests for parole were consistently denied. Authorities determined that his crimes had caused irreversible harm and that his release would be an affront to justice. In February 2020, Roy Norris died at age 72 from natural causes. His death was noted with little fanfare. No ceremony, no memorial. For many, his passing marked the quiet end of one half of a criminal duo that had haunted Southern California for decades. Lawrence Bittaker outlived his accomplice by only a short time. He remained incarcerated on death row for nearly 4 decades, housed in a small cell in the secure facility at San Quentin. Over the years, he became infamous among true crime circles and criminology studies, a case example of planned, psychopathic behavior with forensic precision. On December 13th, 2019, Lawrence Bittaker died of natural causes at the age of 79. His death occurred in the prison hospital. The cause was not disclosed in detail, but it marked the end of one of California's longest-running death row stays. He died without ever facing execution, without ever confessing, without ever expressing sympathy for the families whose lives he had torn apart. One of the most devastating aspects was that none of the victims were ever supposed to be targeted. These were ordinary teenagers. Some were hitchhiking, some were walking home, some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their stories serve as painful reminders of how ordinary decisions, accepting a ride, going out alone, trusting a stranger, can be twisted by the predatory intentions of the wrong people